Hello everyone. We're starting off tonight with a topic that everyone can relate to, sleep. Or more precisely, how people slept in the Middle Ages, which is far stranger than most of us realize. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Additionally, tell me in the comments what time it is for you and where you are tuning in from. Seeing who is joining us from around the globe is always exciting. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. Prior to the invention of electricity, TikTok, and sleep hygiene, medieval folks had a nightly routine that would confound melatonin enthusiasts today. A natural two-part sleep cycle that neatly divided in half like a stale medieval cookie was known as segmented sleep. It was a straightforward routine. The majority of people went to bed early after sundown, falling into what was referred to as first slumber. Then after 4 hours or so, they would consciously wake up and undertake what can only be called medieval midnight multitasking for the next hour or two. This was simply the way sleep operated and wasn't seen as insomnia. It was believed that the watch period between the two sleeps was beneficial, practical, and sometimes frighteningly social. Because nothing disrupts your REM cycle like wondering if your goat is still in the yard, people utilize this time to pray, read religious books, tend fires, or check on their livestock. Indeed, this was seen as the best time for intimacy as well. The body was well rested and peaceful of mind during this time, according to medieval doctors and marriage manuals. This sounds like a kind way of saying that the person was too exhausted to dispute. Just know that your forefathers were setting the bar extremely differently if you ever felt romantic about getting up early to make your partner coffee. This break would be followed by the second nap, which would endure until dawn. Everyone took part in this nocturnal rhythm, from farmers to monks. Yes, people were writing about improper sleep even in medieval literature, as evidenced by the casual mention of it made by literary greats like Chaucer. Surprisingly, contemporary research has indicated that individuals may really prefer divided sleep. In the absence of artificial light, the two-sleep cycle is consistent with the way our circadian rhythms function. The next time you're awake at 2 in the morning, don't freak out. Instead, say in a whisper, "Yes, the watch has started," and then tend to a symbolic hearth. Humans didn't start enforcing the concept of 8 unbroken hours as if sleep were a timed sport until the industrial era, with factories, gaslighting, and the growing fear of unproductivity. Whether they liked it or not, everyone in the medieval world was on the same schedule, so waking up in the middle of the night wasn't a sign of failure. Let's discuss beds, or more specifically, the approximate medieval version of them. We are obsessed with thread counts, memory foam, cooling gels, and whether or not a mattress is cloud-like in today's society. A bed in medieval Europe was frequently nothing more than a heap of once-living objects that had been crushed under the weight of restless nights and silent laments. A straw mattress, called a pallet, served as the standard peasant bed. If they had the luxury of a bag, this was actually hay or straw packed into a rough fabric sack. Otherwise, it was merely straw on the ground, possibly wet, and perhaps already occupied by a feline. Although these pallets were uncomfortable, they were preferable to the alternative of nothing. Straw was inexpensive, widely available, and effective in keeping out the cold. Additionally, it was excellent at harboring insects, lice, and the rare field mouse, which made sleeping a careful silence exercise. You disregarded it if it itched. You simply moved a little and hoped for the best if it bit. A family might raise the straw mattress onto a wooden frame if they had a little more cash, or at least a back that worked. This decreased the likelihood of waking up with insects in your ear, but it didn't significantly alter the quality of your sleep. Just a little. Linens were an uncommon luxury. The The majority of folks slept in their daytime attire. Personal space was non-existent, and neither were pajamas. Sometimes on the same straw pile, entire families slept together, including parents, kids, and possibly grandparents. You could always roll into your cousin's elbow if you became too hot. Naturally, nobles had comfortable beds, canopies, embroidered linens, feather beds, and large wooden frames to keep out drafts and, ideally, lice. Because of their high value, these beds were bequeathed in wills. Land was not inherited by you. Aunt Matilda left you her oddly uncomfortable feather bed. However, a bed was not a comfortable place for the majority of medieval people. It was a place to be warm, to stay away from the chickens, and perhaps, just possibly, to hope that one day you would be wealthy enough to sleep on something that didn't rustle or squawk. Nowadays, a cozy small drink comes to mind when we hear the term nightcap. It might involve whiskey, a cozy fire, and a dubious choice. However, a nightcap was not a beverage during the Middle Ages. It was a hat, an actual, palpable, and frequently absurd-looking piece of cloth that is intended to prevent your head from freezing off as you sleep. You see, medieval architecture wasn't particularly good at providing insulation. Stone buildings, drafty thatched roofs, and windows constructed of thin animal horn or oiled paper didn't do much against the cold. What about central heating? That was called a dog. Medieval people therefore adopted the simple nightcap to keep their heads warm at night, especially as body heat exits through the scalp the fastest. Although these hats were available in a variety of sizes and shapes, the most famous style was long and pointed, resembling the hat worn by a wizard who also works as a chimney sweeper. Typically, they were constructed from linen, wool, or any remaining warmth that could be used without upsetting the family goat. It was a useful accessory for men. For women, it occasionally functioned as a head wrap or coif, which had the added benefits of preserving modesty and hiding hair that hadn't been washed since Lent. However, nightcaps have social significance in addition to comfort. In some locations, married women were expected to cover their heads at all times, indeed, even when you're asleep. Additionally, the cap itself could be dyed or embroidered to represent the riches or prestige of a family. Because nothing says success like going to bed with a little flag on your skull. The nightcap even came to represent being off-duty in more urban contexts. Wearing one was a courteous medieval manner of stating, "I'm not dressed for conversation," when you opened your door. This hat does indeed imply, "go away." Naturally, nightshirts, basically long, loose tunics, were frequently worn with nightcaps. Picture Ebenezer Scrooge minus the ghostly moral message. Sleepwear was useful, itchy, and sometimes flammable, but it wasn't sexy. These days, sleeping next to a stranger is usually reserved for the odd Airbnb mix-up, two ambitious camping outings, or red-eye flights. However, this was absolutely necessary and not at all optional in medieval Europe. Suppose you are a pilgrim, a traveling merchant, or simply someone whose mule broke down midway to Norwich. You locate an inn, which is a unique luxury in and of itself, and request a bed. What you get is not a room, or a bed, or even a very clean floor. What you get is a spot in a bed that's already occupied. Medieval inns operated more like human bunkhouses than modern hotels. Privacy was not expected. If the bed had room, you were sharing it, usually with complete strangers who might snore, chat in their sleep, or have an unusual number of boils. This was not deemed rude, it was just efficient use of resources. Depending on size and social tolerance, beds might accommodate 2, 3, or even 4 travelers. In bigger cities, you may find yourself in a hall that resembles a hostel, with rows of beds and no personal space at all. Contests for snoring were not evaluated. There was intense competition for elbow territory. Though not always, men and women were kept apart at times. A few inns attempted to assign beds based on occupation. clergy with clergy, thieves with other thieves, blacksmiths with blacksmiths, etc. However, it was frequently first come, first sprawled. Additionally, this was an improvement over sleeping outside with wolves, weather, and the occasional peasant revolt, even though it may sound like a nightmare to modern germaphobes. Concerned about stealing? Many travelers hid their purses under their clothing or attached them to their belts while they slept. Others used their bags as an alarm system and pillow by sleeping on top of their packages. If your bag was changed, it usually signaled that you were going to wake up with less money. Naturally, this destiny did not befall the wealthy. When an innkeeper valued their roof, nobles demanded their own rooms, travelled with entourages, and camped in relative comfort. It was not enough to simply pull up a blanket and fall asleep in the medieval world. Your everlasting soul was at stake in this nightly gamble, which was a spiritual operation. Not only did they sleep, but they also got ready to die. This explains why bedtime prayers are so common. Forget soothing podcasts or lavender spray. Confessions, psalms, and spiritual passages that purify the soul were woven into medieval sleepers' sheets in case they passed away between good night and daybreak. The concept was straightforward. Disease, fire, demons, or, most perilous of all, being older than 30 in 1247 might kill you at any time. It would be wise for you to say your prayers. Hell was frightening, and you didn't want to arrive unannounced, dirty, and spiritually disheveled, not because it was consoling. A single, popular version? If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Isn't that sweet? However, it's essentially a legal agreement that a 7-year-old wrote, admitting that death is a possible conclusion at bedtime. Many adults had a long list of prayers for various dangers, one for the times you felt bad, one for those moments when you may have worried that the devil was hidden in the rafters, one for preventing the plague, which regrettably did not age well. Similar to holy bouncers protecting your soul at the club door, some people even prayed to particular saints who were known for keeping watch on sleepers. Compline was the last prayer service before bed, and it was how the most pious monks, nuns, and unduly nervous aristocrats concluded their days. They took a vow of silence after Compline, which wasn't difficult because everyone was already worn out, malnourished, and a little scared of the dark. In part because it was beneficial to their souls, and partly because it provided them with something to do besides questioning why the dog was back in their bed. Children were also encouraged to pray. It seems cute when parents tell their children that angels are watching, but it turns out to be more of a celestial surveillance system than a guardian angel. To put it briefly, praying before bed was more about repairing harm at the last minute than it was about finding serenity. Consider it similar to antiviral software from the Middle Ages. Even though you weren't really sure how it worked, you prayed it did. Dreams are typically written off in today's society as meaningless gibberish, stress, eating too much cheese, or your brain trying to organize documents in the dark. But in the medieval world, dreams were taken very seriously, as in eternal consequences serious. Dreams were regarded as messages, not merely dreams, from the devil, God, saints, your guardian angel, or maybe that strange artifact you kissed last Sunday. While some dreams were devilish temptations, others were insights from God. In any case, you were expected to pay attention and, just for safety, perhaps write it down, confess it, or fast for 3 days. The amount of time dedicated to dream interpretation by theologians, monks, and self-styled visionaries was startling. Decoding them was the subject of entire works. Had a fire-related dream? It might be awful. Have you had a dream about water? Could signify drowning or purifying. Have you ever dreamed of a man juggling fish with a goat's head? You should probably move and call a priest right now. Because your spirit was still functioning while you slept, medieval people thought that what transpired in your dreams was significant. This implied that your behavior in a dream might disclose unspoken transgressions or spiritual frailties. That dream about stealing a loaf of bread that was a little embarrassing, that could be your subconscious apologizing for your excess in the actual world, or simply hunger. Still, it's best to come clean just in case. Dreams were frequently written down and discussed with spiritual superiors by monks and nuns. Some were praised for experiencing divine visions while they slept. Before going to bed, others were subtly instructed to eat fewer onions. Dreams were more than just spiritual riddles, of course. They were also great plot devices. There are several dream sequences in medieval literature in which knights are confronted by angels, demons, or other symbolic beings who recite poetry about virtue. Dreams were essentially the medieval equivalent of Netflix, only with less happy endings and more metaphor. Naturally, the church was suspicious. Dreams were thought to be seeded by demons to corrupt the innocent, and not all of them were divine. If you had an unwholesome dream, it can indicate that you were sleeping too near to the fireplace fumes again, or that your soul was being attacked. Some individuals now allow their pets to sleep in the bed. It's a cozy, if sometimes odorous, setup. However, it wasn't a peculiar personal preference to share a bed with an animal during the Middle Ages. It was a method of heating. Let's begin with the fundamentals. Homes in the Middle Ages weren't exactly designed to be comfortable. Lack of insulation, stone walls, and drafts so severe they most likely had names. Central heating. It was referred to as the family pig. Living together in the same room, often the same bed, and frequently the same stack of straw was commonplace in peasant households. Pigs snorted softly beside the fireplace, dogs snuggled up at your feet, and chickens roamed freely. And if you were fortunate, none of them stung you at night. This had nothing to do with love, though medieval people did love their animals. It was a matter of survival. Animals produced heat through their bodies. They were reliable, warm, and didn't hog the blanket like other relatives do. Your toes might not freeze if you have a big dog. It felt miraculous in January that a cow in the corner could bring the room's temperature up by 1 or 2 degrees. One room was frequently used for everything in medieval dwellings, particularly those of the lower classes: cooking, eating, sleeping, and sometimes passing away. Animals and humans alike shared the same space and had to make do. Children could be tucked in between a goat and its parents. You could use a chicken as a makeshift alarm clock. Cleanliness? Let's keep our questions to ourselves. This wasn't as prevalent for households with more money. Nobles may have had lapdogs in their beds, but they rarely slept next to animals, not for heat, but for redistribution of fleas and fashion. Because nothing conveys power like a dog with its own chamber and title, some castles even maintained separate sleeping quarters for favorite animals. Of course, there were disadvantages. Animals have a tendency to make noise. They can wander, and they are not, historically speaking, known for respecting personal space. But medieval people adapted. At 3 a.m., a hoof in the face, merely a component of the nightly ritual. Allow us to introduce the medieval monastic dormitory, a place where comfort went to die quietly under a vow of silence, in case you've ever had to share a room at a youth hostel and thought, this is a bit much. In actuality, monasteries didn't value enjoyment, tenderness, or personal space. Dozens of monks, typically grouped in tidy rows like morally upright sardines, slept in a single, spacious chamber in the typical dormitory, usually made of wooden planks, beds, if you can call them that. Occasionally had a straw mattress if the abbot was feeling particularly giving, or it was a feast day. You slept fully dressed, not out of modesty, but because it was more agonizing to get dressed in the dark for prayers at 2 a.m. than it was to simply go to bed ready. The monastery outfit, which included sandals, a belt, and a robe, served as both inadequate insulation and spiritual armor. You layered up if you became cold. If you become hot, you didn't. No privacy curtains, no pillows, and no conversation at all. Under St. Benedict's rule, silence was required rather than encouraged. You may spend a week on chamber pot duty if you rolled over and let out a loud moan. But snoring was a grey area. Even if you had no control over it, the Lord might still hold you responsible if it started to cause trouble, or your fellow inmates would. There was very little lighting, perhaps only one candle. All you had to do was lie motionless and refrain from sin. You didn't need to see. That was the objective. Despite the restraint, monks thought that by depriving the flesh of luxury, their Spartan beds were preparing the soul for the journey to the afterlife. Sleep was not a luxury, rather it was a need that was planned and managed just like everything else. In order to prevent any suggestion of luxury, dreams, or circulation, some monks even slept while sitting up. In contrast, snoring pigs and mounds of peasant straw nearly appear like luxury. The pig didn't judge you, at least. Let's discuss a topic that would terrify the majority of contemporary sleepers: choosing to get up at 2 in the morning for prayer rather than a toilet break or a doom scroll. Prayer by candlelight, loud and frigid. This was the norm in monasteries during the Middle Ages. The strict daily routine that monks and nuns adhered to was based on the canonical hours, which included matins, the day's first ceremony. We mean the darkest hour of the night, when even the owls were still debating whether or not to wake up. When we say day, usually someone who drew the short straw would ring the bell, and the whole dormitory of robed, sleep-deprived individuals would silently trudge out to the chapel. Indeed, they were still fully clothed, as monks did not use pajamas. They only accepted a spiritual layering system. They would read scriptures, chant psalms, and do their best not to nod off while standing in the chapel's flickering lighting and the echo of the stone vaults, which was a serious problem, incidentally. Monks who fall asleep during prayer have reportedly been disciplined by having to perform additional tasks or offer longer prayers. You dozed off in the morning? Congrats! You will now be in charge of the next one. Matins could go on for an hour or longer. Some orders were so excited that they extended it to 2. Imagine attempting to maintain your spiritual focus when your body is aggressively shutting down and your stomach reminds you that dinner was a bowl of lentils and a moral lesson. Monks would either go back to bed for a second nap after the ceremony or, under more rigorous rules, immediately begin studying or working by hand. Because threshing wheat after 4 hours of broken rest tells more about holy discipline than anything else. Why so early? The plan was to forego comfort in order to devote the first and quietest hour of the night to God, free from the distractions of warmth, daylight, or REM cycles. It served as a potent devotional symbol. Or it was when you got beyond Brother Ambrose's off-key chanting, the candle smoke and the numb feet. Nowadays, sleeping alone is frequently presented as a luxury, a symbol of freedom, tranquility, or simply the capacity to manage the blanket. However, sleeping alone was viewed as suspicious, unfeasible, or simply dangerous in the medieval era. Let's begin with the fundamentals: warmth. As we've seen, beds weren't particularly warm, central heating was still a few plagues away, and open chimneys and stone walls did little to retain heat. Therefore, out of basic thermal desperation, rather than intimacy, people shared beds to keep warm. Children shared beds with their parents, siblings, and perhaps the neighbor's child when they were over. No one asked if you wanted to go, so it was more like a sleepover. But sleeping in groups had a spiritual purpose in addition to being comfortable. The night was thought by many to be when the devil worked overtime. Your soul may be susceptible to seduction or, worse, possession if it is left alone in the dark. There was a sort of moral buffer zone produced by the presence of others. At least someone would see it happen or catch the demon first if something went wrong. Being by themselves at night was almost unimaginable for kids, not only for comfort, but because the evening environment included fairies, ghosts, and wandering souls. Stories cautioned against sleeping alone since it can lead to trouble and spiritual danger. These stories also didn't conclude with embraces in contrast to the goodnight stories of today. They ended up going missing. Children, servants, or uninvited visitors frequently shared beds with married couples. Privacy was more of a contemporary myth than a concept. In actuality, it would have been regarded as wasteful or extremely suspicious for two individuals to sleep alone in a big bed because it was such an alien concept. Even monks frequently slept in communal settings in religious situations. Additionally, it was frequently for disciplinary reasons that someone was made to sleep alone. Being alone yourself in bed was, in fact, a punishment in certain situations. Solitary sleep, medieval reasoning, and grass-based opportunities for sin. Public accountability and group slumber. Enjoy the quiet the next time you're in your own bed, with your own blanket, in a room that doesn't smell like goat. A cousin, 2 children, and a sheepdog would most likely be in there with you in the Middle Ages, all of whom would be snoring. You most likely woke up with a crick in your neck and a great deal of regret if you've ever unintentionally fallen asleep while sitting up in a lecture, a carriage, or the waiting area of a dentist. However, sleeping upright was not a coincidence during the Middle Ages. It was a way of life. Some people in the Middle Ages preferred to sleep propped up rather than flat, especially those who were wealthy or religiously pious. Why? A couple of reasons, none of them very calming. Initially, it was thought by doctors that lying flat was detrimental to the lungs, digestion, or overall equilibrium of the body's humours. This reasoning made perfect sense in a world where doctors believed that a sneeze might restructure your soul. They thought that sleeping upright prevented brain congestion, which sounds sinister, but just means that you shouldn't drown in your own phlegm. There were also spiritual issues. It was thought that lying flat was too similar to the dead's position. You didn't want to sleep in the same position used at funerals for fear of confusing God, or worse, drawing the attention of the angel of death. Superstitious, of course. However, you chose your battles wisely when your local priest also served as the community's health advisor. Because of this, individuals frequently slept with their heads propped up by pillows, big bolsters, or the wooden headboard equivalent of a medieval lazy boy. In order to retain a semi-seated position, nobles occasionally had their beds constructed with angled supports. This was ideal for preventing unexpected demon attacks or for digesting their evening meat pie. The monks went one step further. In stricter orders, they might even sleep sitting upright on a bench or leaning against a cold wall with nothing but a hood to muffle the discomfort. It has nothing to do with health, it has to do with self-control. You could dream if you were too at ease. Dreaming could lead to sin. Welcome to confession at 5 in the morning if you have sinned. This was obviously not about getting a good night's sleep. It was about discomfort, virtue, and religion that was vaguely perplexing. Put goblins under the bed and scary nightmares out of your mind. The true monsters of the night were already in the sheets for medieval folks. They were little, tenacious, and completely unconcerned with your prayers. Naturally, we are discussing lice, fleas, and the bedbug, the unofficial mascot of the medieval bedroom. Let's not mince words. Medieval Europe wasn't particularly good at hygiene. Laundry was costly, baths were uncommon, and soap was occasionally manufactured from ingredients that were better left nameless. When you combine it with communal bedding, mattresses packed with straw, and the occasional live chicken underfoot, you have the makings of an all-you-can-eat insect buffet. Lice and fleas were so prevalent that they were essentially living together. Every day, peasants had to cope with them. Despite their feather beds and luxurious linens, nobility were not above the law. Indeed, nitpickers, actual slaves assigned to remove lice from their employers' hair and clothing, were a common sight in certain wealthier homes. Suppose you were employed as master of the royal scalp. In contrast, bedbugs were the quiet killers of medieval slumber. Like little vampires, they lurked in the fissures in stone walls, the seams of mattresses, and even wooden bed frames. At night, they came out to feed. If you've ever wondered why medieval folk slept fully dressed and wore nightcaps, the answer isn't always warmth. At times, it was armor for protecting against pests. The solutions were impressively insane to moderately effective. To keep bugs away, some homes burnt fragrant herbs like tansy or wormwood. Others slept with ashes, garlic, or onions in the bed, which may have reduced romance but may have had little effect on pests. Nor was it merely physical discomfort. Fleas were frequently viewed as unpleasant reminders of the fall of man and bad bedding choices, as well as emblems of sin or moral impurity. There were whole poetry on fleas, some of them strangely beautiful, some of them moralizing. Let's stick together like the flea that bites us both, because nothing screams "I love you" like that. So while modern sleep is interrupted by buzzing phones and streetlights, medieval sleep was more likely disturbed by scratching, twitching, and the subtle feeling that something was crawling on your shin, because it was. Everybody has experienced sleepless nights. But have you ever tried falling asleep while wearing 100 pounds of iron? No? Well, in the Middle Ages, some people did exactly that because apparently nothing says sweet dreams like being prepared to joust in your sleep. To be clear, not even knights slept in full armor on a regular basis. It was loud, hot, and heavy. Trying to roll over in a suit of chainmail is a bit like trying to nap inside a bag of cutlery. But during wartime or in hostile territory, sleeping partially armored was considered the safer choice. Comfort? Optional. Survival? Highly recommended. During a campaign, a knight may only take off his gauntlets and helmet, leaving his breastplate or mail shirt on in case his adversaries decide to throw a surprise party at midnight. Nothing compares to having to get dressed while still half dreaming about turnips after waking up to the sound of hooves. Men-at-arms, like some really aggressive bedtime security blankets, may even sleep with swords or axes by their sides in besieged castles. The shields were pillows, and at least you wouldn't have to get dressed if the attackers managed to get past the barriers. Priorities. Sleeping in armor was not exactly a restorative experience, of course. Chainmail has a terrible propensity of pinching skin, and iron isn't breathable. The combination of chilly stone flooring, little bedding, and the background noise of snoring friends and crackling fires creates a sleeping environment that is about as comfortable as an airport terminal. Even non-combatants occasionally slept in hazardous areas while wearing minimal protective gear. Gambesons were heavy quilted jackets that provided a little more cushioning and protection than the moral support of prayer alone, and traveling merchants or guards on watch duty would take naps in them. Not to mention, the armor wasn't exactly understated. You might clank so loudly if you rolled over the wrong direction that everyone else would wake up and think the end of the world had come. In an era when lice infestations, pigs in your bed, and nighttime devils weren't uncommon, you may assume that sleepwalking was just another medieval annoyance. It was even more dramatic than that, though. During the Middle Ages, walking around while you slept was not attributed to worry or fatigue. They assumed you were possessed, bewitched, or had unfinished business with the Holy Roman Empire. Insufficiently understood and frequently dreaded was sleepwalking, or noctambulation, if you wished to impress the local monk. It was more devil's rehearsal dinner than innocuous parasomnia to think that someone could get up from their straw cot, shuffle across the room, and stare blankly at a wall. According to historical accounts, sleepwalkers actually frightened people. Imagine this. A man in a long nightshirt, candle in hand, eyes glazed, mumbling Latin that he didn't actually speak while stepping over livestock. You'd think ghost or heretic or both. Additionally, an exorcism may be planned prior to breakfast, contingent on your local priest. Some people thought that bad humor, particularly too much black bile, which was the medieval catch-all for anything they couldn't explain, was the cause of sleepwalking. Others said it occurred because the body was left to stumble around like an unsupervised mule while the soul was momentarily liberated during sleep. People used herbal cures, hanging iron charms, praying over their beds, and, in more rural places, simply tying the person's leg to a chair as ways to stop these nightly adventures. If you think it's severe, think about the fact that some medieval homes had chamber pots ready to be tragically overturned, open hearths, and blades around. In an odd turn of events, there were reports of individuals sleeping on rooftops. Whether or not these stories were overblown, the fear of leaping dreamers resulted in windows being barred, and sporadic theological arguments concerning the possibility of guilt when unconscious. The majority of sleepwalkers, fortunately, only paced, grumbled, or tried to unlock fictitious doors. To cover all spiritual bases, however, if someone sleepwalked into a church, the locals would interpret it as a sign from God or demand a cleaning ceremony. If medieval life taught people anything, it was how to sleep through chaos. Thunderstorms, shrieking cattle, church bells, and the occasional siege. These were simply ambient noises, the medieval equivalent of white noise to the sleep-deprived people of the Middle Ages. First, let's talk about the bells. Every holy moment of the day was signalled by church bells. Meals, prayer times, sunrises, and of course the evil hour of matins at 2 or 3 in the morning. If you lived anywhere near a monastery, your dreams were probably soundtracked by regular tolling. At some point, the brain just accepted it. Bells became the lullaby of an overscheduled soul. It wasn't just bells either. Storms were common and dangerous. You felt as though the world could end with every thunderclap because you didn't have triple glazed windows or weather apps. Chimneys howled like banshees, windows rocked, and roofs leaked. People were still sleeping. They were forced to. Sleeplessness didn't stop the work. Running from Vikings, praying, or ploughing didn't help either. In addition, invasions and the end of the world weren't always a deal-breaker for bedtime. Despite poverty, battle, and even the Black Death, individuals managed to sleep through the 14th century. Death carts passing by in the morning were not seen as a reason for alarm, but rather as a sobering wake-up call. What if you were asleep? Well, some thought that was a blessing. People have even been known to sleep during barn fires, earthquakes, and irate crowds. Lack of sleep was frequent, and bodies adapted. You were going to sleep if you worked from dawn till dusk, ate just enough to get by, and spent the day avoiding taxes, muck, and spiritual damnation. Hard. Afterward, several people utilized sleep as a kind of escape. Some individuals just curled up under a cloak, said a prayer, and napped when faced with illness, bereavement, or the worry that the world would truly end, which was predicted to happen approximately every century.